Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Gwen Bradford, and we're going to talk about theories of ill being. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Jason. It's great to be here.
Yeah, for the listeners who don't know, Gwen was actually my external reader for my
That's right.
dissertation, so we can
That's
we
right.
go far back.
We go way back.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in learning more about this topic because, I'm familiar with the philosophy of well-being literature, and when you engage in that literature, I think you just naturally kind of think about what the opposite of well-being would be, which would be ill-being, right? So I know that there are four major theories of well-being. We have hedonism, we have desire-satisfactionism, we have objectivist theory, and we have like nature fulfillment theory. That's kind of like how I categorize it. And so I was hoping that we can kind of go through each of them and then kind of discuss what the corresponding theory of ill-being would be. Or maybe there's this separate, entirely new theory of ill-being that doesn't really fall under one of the four theories of well-being. I don't know. But yeah, so why don't we do that? Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. All right. So one thing that I want to clarify is like when philosophers talk about theories of well-being, what we're interested in are things that are non-instrumentally good for you, right? We're interested in things that increase our well-being, but they're good in and of themselves. So, we don't care about vitamins. We're not really talking about vitamins that have
That's
like
right. That's right.
instrumental value, right? So I'm thinking that the corresponding theory of ill-being would be like that as well. So what we're talking about is non-instrumental things, non-instrumentally bad things, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, and maybe I can um color it in a little more than that as well. So, because it's also helpful, I think, to think about when we think about well-being, it's not just a matter of feeling good, or it might be, but we mean something sort of richer in the sense of what has, say, moral significance, what gives normative reasons to both yourself and to others. It's the sort of thing that makes for a life well lived, makes for a good life, the kinds of things that you have reason to care about in your life and in the lives of the people to whom you are responsible. So I think it's important also to clarify in that sense that so it's not only the things that are intrinsically good for you or good for you for their own sake, but they're also but in saying that we mean that they're the whatever well-being is, it has a lot of significance. It's not simply something ephemeral or being merely in a good mood, but what matters in a sort of deep way. So likewise for ill-being. So ill-being presumably isn't just when we talk about things being bad for you in the sense that ill-being would be bad for you. It's not merely things that uh, are instrumentally bad for you. So if you miss the bus and then you're late for your appointment, that seems like it might be instrumentally bad for you. Uh, but the thing that's really intrinsically bad for you or robustly bad for you, actually bad for you, would say being in pain as a result of tripping and falling and skinning your knee, or the failure that results as a result of your missed appointment with the job interview or something like that. So those things themselves directly constitute something that is bad in your life. And this turns out to be so sort of a little bit puzzling when we think about theories of well-being, um, because we're not just interested in, say, some being missing out on some good, but when we talk about ill-being, it seems that there's some things that are actually in sort of as paradoxical as that was a positive presence of something that's actually bad, as opposed to something merely missing out on some good that you would have had otherwise. So that, as I'm sure we'll discuss, ends up being one of the more tricky aspects of accounting for ill-being.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's start with the first one, hedonism, right? I feel like that's a pretty simple and straightforward theory. It says that the sole non-instrumental good is pleasure, and then the sole non-instrumental bad would be pain. Correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it seems right off the bat that hedonism does great accounting for what's bad for you because it gives you a perfectly symmetrical account of what's bad for you. It's symmetrical with what's good for you. If pleasure is the only non-instrumental good, pain is the only non-instrumental bad, and it sure seems like pain. If anything is intrinsically bad for you, it would be pain. And so hedonism seems to get that exactly right. Um, but it's also perhaps a little more complicated than that. Since it's we might think, for example, that not all pains are bad, or perhaps more than pain is bad. But at least hedonism has going for it that it says that some pains are bad.
Yeah. We can consistently hold the position, like, two positions, right? One is that pain is intrinsically bad for you, and that pain can be potentially good for you. It can be instrumentally good.
That's certainly right. Yes. And hedonism wouldn't deny that. So I guess it's pretty easy to think of some examples of pains that are instrumentally good for you. You sort of learn from some painful experience, makes you stronger, more resilient to experience some pain some of the time. Um, but that's perfectly consistent with all of those instrumentally good pains being also intrinsically bad for you. So the hedonist is committed to that.
Yeah. When we talk about these non-instrumental goods or bads, it's very hard for me to get around the important role of our intuitions. If you were to ask me why I think pleasure is not instrumentally good or pain not instrumentally bad, I wouldn't be able to give you any explanation. It's just this axiom that I just come to due to, I don't know, life experience, personal experience, having been in pain. I'm just like, yeah, it really sucks. It's just I can't really give you a further explanation of why I think it's bad for you.
Yeah. And I think in a way that's almost an advantage of hedonism, and in that the goodness of pleasure and the badness of pain are so obvious to anyone who's ever felt them, that it almost seems that they don't need any further defense. Even Mill says in his defense of hedonism and utilitarianism that ultimate ends do not admit of proof. Um, he then actually goes on to give a really bad argument for the value of pleasure, but presumably we don't need his bad argument or any other. If you've ever felt pleasure, then you have a good ground for understanding that it is in fact good, and likewise for pain. Um, I think there could be more. There could actually be more to say there about how it is that we in fact know that, and I think there's actually more philosophical fruit to be gathered in exploring that question.
Do you think that a more charitable interpretation of hedonism would include other things besides physical pleasure and other things besides physical pain for the flip side?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that there's no reason to think that when we talk about pleasure and pain in terms of well-being, we're certainly not looking only at physical pleasure and physical pain. We also mean whatever else we have in mind by enjoyable experiences. They might be emotional experiences, anything that has a sort of positive feeling tone. And likewise for pain. Of course, there is physical pain on the one hand, but we all, I'm sure, are familiar with what we might say psychological pain or affective or emotional pain, any experience that is unpleasant in some way or has a sort of negative valence of feel to it, as some people like to put it. And the hedonist will say that all of those experiences that feel good on the one hand are good, and all of those experiences that feel bad on the other hand are bad. Um, so it's much more broad than simply physical pleasure or physical pain.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. This is kind of a tangent, but I want to pick your brain on this because this is something I've been thinking about, and since I have you here, I've been thinking about the relation between pain and memory. Because I'm thinking about in the medical context, right? So let's say like you undergo this painful procedure, but they give you this medication that makes you forget, right? They give you Versed or whatever, you don't remember it. I'm not entirely sure how that affects your overall well-being. Like, because in my mind, your overall well-being is constituted by your like independent momentary well-beings and added together, right? So D I would say that your momentary well-being would be lower because you are feeling that pain, but it feels like I would have to conclude that your overall well-being would be lower too, even though you don't remember it.
This is a fascinating question, and I think it has not really been given the attention that it deserves in the philosophical community, and I would be curious to hear what people who think about medical ethics also think about this, because indeed, it does not at all seem obvious that just because you forget about a pain, that it should be somehow contribute less to the overall value, the overall amount of well-being or ill-being that you have in your life. If each unit of pain, as it were, counts just as much as every other, which is a sort of extremely plausible, hard to deny tenet of hedonism all the way since Mill, then the sort of the fact that you forgot about it doesn't why should that make a difference in whether or not it was bad for you? Presumably at the time it was extremely bad for you. And it's bizarre that we should think that we somehow privilege the present moment in giving us the verdict, as it were, of how of your overall life's well-being. That seems especially implausible if we think of say towards the end of one's life in cases of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, or even just just forgetting slightly, being slightly less connected in terms of memory to the earlier parts of our lives. It doesn't seem that that phase of our life is when when we have the sort of most accurate measure of how well the life went if we can't remember things clearly. It's totally puzzling, and yeah, from what I understand, there are many medical procedures that are sort of the pain they're painful. The pain is not well, perhaps you can fill in some of the details. I know so I learned about this about having so because I had my wisdom teeth out a long time ago, of course. And then I later found out that in that procedure, it's quite typical that you actually feel quite a lot of pain at the time, but you're sort of sedated, so you don't mind. And then you're given some other drug, so you just forget about the whole thing. And this, when I found that out, I was actually totally horrified. I mean, that just seems awful. It seems like, yeah, that's true. I don't remember it, but it's like that. What a terrible thing to do to somebody. It doesn't make it any better to just wipe their memory.
Yeah.
But maybe that's I think the philosophical view kind of just straightforward hedonism, that is indeed what it tells you. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure yet, and I don't know if I'll, eventually write a paper on this. But I mean, like the dentist case, I think it's pretty common, right? It's like because like I have to get sedated because I just have dental anxiety, like really bad dental anxiety. But they give me Versed, I think that's what they give me, and it prevents me from forming new memories, right? And it's conscious sedation, so you are awake, like because you can follow commands, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm glad that I get it, right? Like, because I don't wanna remember it. You know what I mean? So, like, from
Yeah.
personal experience, it seems obvious to me that it is better for me, right? That my overall well-being is higher because of the fact that I don't remember it. But it's just a little bit puzzling to me as to, like, why I actually feel that way, because if I do think that your overall well-being is just a sum of your independent momentary well-beings, it wouldn't follow. So then maybe the way to go about this is, well, the reason why it's overall better for me is because I don't have the painful memory, right? So every
Yes,
time I
exactly.
think about it, it causes me pain. And so because I'm missing that part, it's better for me.
Yeah, that's certainly right. I think that's so it makes you so the forgetting part is better for you insofar as you now don't have you're not reminded of it. You don't recall these frightening moments which themselves would be painful to recall. So that seems better. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there was still this moment that you don't remember that was also bad for you. So it seems like if we could make the best version of the situation is if you didn't have any of that pain in the first place. So that would be even better than forgetting it. So we can give an explanation for why forgetting it is better than remembering it. But that doesn't so I guess it's good to forget it, but
Yeah.
it's not overall good. It's just not as bad
It's just
as
as
it
bad.
would
Yeah.
be if you had these bad memories of it. Yeah. So there's still this so I guess, uh, the people who work on, pain relief and so on, I guess from a philosophical perspective, my suggestion would be it would be even better if we could, it doesn't excuse the pain from happening in the first place. It would be better if that pain wasn't there at all. Although, of course, it is better if someone forgets it than remembers it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, all else equal, you just shouldn't. I mean, like, it's better for you not to feel the pain at all. In the
Yes.
case
Yeah.
of the dentist, I suspect that there's, like, a functional reason to why they have conscious sedation, right? It's probably because, like, they need you to follow commands, like, they need you to bite down when, when they tell you to,
That's right.
so you can check your bite and, stuff like that. So, I mean, that makes sense. But then that still kinda raises the question to me, which is the importance of memory and being able to form new memories in that state while you're feeling pain, because I don't know it, like, it's such an interesting case because usually we can form new memories, right? Like, if I feel this pain, I immediately remember it like 1 second or 2 seconds later. But if I lack the ability to form that new memory, I'm just this, I don't know, like, concurrent being that has no ability to remember what I just experienced a split second ago. Like, how does that it's just it's weird. Like, I don't know how to make sense of that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you're psychologically disconnected
Yes.
from the other parts of you, which are continuous with themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a really deep and important issue, and I think actually in the philosophy of well-being, I think there's quite a lot to be said here. I'm inclined to think that it's somewhat underexplored as how the question of psychological connectedness really makes a difference for our well-being and how that's evaluated. Um, because I can imagine on some views, so, like the Parfit view of personal identity, which says that there is no sort of like one sort of impermeable person who goes throughout life. Rather, our identity is more a matter of these overlapping threads. But of course, when we have one of these discontinuous chunks, I think it might follow from that view that you are not that person who felt that pain in that moment. So that might be a way in which we could say that it's not bad for you, it was bad for, um, the entity that was inhabiting your body at that moment, but that's not you, because you aren't continuous with that. But that to my mind sounds
Yeah.
extremely artificial as much as
Yeah.
I find the perfect view of personal identity, pretty appealing. I think the importance of memory is there. It almost seems like there's something very bad about being disconnected from that segment of yourself. And of course, I think we're not wrong to be worried about conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, where we are, and that's what's so horrifying about them is that we're disconnected from ourselves, and that yeah, and it's certainly not readily explained by hedonism why that would be bad for you.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's move on to desire-satisfactionism, right? It says, what's non-instrumentally good for you is to attain your, I guess, like the things that you believe are not instrumentally good for you, or like, so it's good to get what you want, and like kind of like the like the high level summary that I give. So if that's the case, then the opposite, what is non-instrumentally bad for you, is to have those desires frustrated.
Yeah, so desire satisfaction theory turns out to be one of the theories for which how one goes about accounting for ill-being is surprisingly complicated. Because it seems like, oh no, what's the big deal? It's just the opposite of being getting what you want is going to be what's bad for you. But getting what you want, it's not actually clear what the opposite of that would be. And of course, the natural thought is that it's not getting what you want, or that is to say, having your desire frustrated. That's what's intrinsically bad for you. And that seems, I think, sort of a natural thought. It seems plausible. But when you look at the view and its theoretical resources, it's not clear that the privation of having your desire satisfied is going to come out on the view as being something that's in fact intrinsically bad for you, as opposed to merely the privation of what's good for you. So not getting the thing that you want, you just don't get it. It's just a privation of what would be good. So you're less well off than you would be had your desire been satisfied. But it's not clear that how the view's internal explanatory mechanism can yield the answer that's actually going below zero, as it were. It's just a
Mhm.
sort of privation of what's good. So this has led uh, so some desire satisfaction theorists, so this is of course very it's a new topic within philosophy of well-being, but at least two desire satisfaction theorists have looked at this question, and they have both kind of pushed for the view that the frustration of desire is not, they sort of agree with this objection that that's not enough to explain what's intrinsically bad for you. Rather, they have to sort of um, look to a different place for the opposite of a desire satisfaction. And the thought is, so if desire is a kind of attitude and the satisfaction of desire is what's good for you, there is, it seems, then we might draw from the thought that there's an opposite attitude, and having the sort of the object of that attitude fulfilled, as it were, that's what's bad for you. And this attitude, of course, would be aversion. So the thought is getting what you're averse to, that's what's bad for you. So when you really hate something and you really don't want it, so it's not just a matter of wanting something and not getting it, which would be a privation. It's being averse to something, which is a more sort of active attitude, and then having the thing come to pass that you're averse to. So both Chris Heathwood and Anthony Kelly have argued that this is the best sort of path forward for the desire satisfaction theorist.
Yeah. Okay. So instead of not getting the promotion, you get fired.
Well, yeah, but even not getting the promotion might be intrinsically bad for you according to desire satisfaction theory if you're averse to not getting the promotion. So you actually have to have this aversive attitude, like an attitude of sort of like hating it,
Hmm.
or being sort of strongly opposed to it, and then it coming to pass. And that could be intrinsically bad for you. Now notice though that it's sort of contingent on having that attitude, and so, if you don't have that attitude, you sort of want the promotion, but you're not averse to not getting the promotion, then that actually could explain why it would be good for you to get promoted, but it's not that it's bad for you to not get promoted. Um,
Hmm.
so I think in your case, it would be the case that you just described. It would be that what you're averse to is getting fired. You
Yeah.
desire to have your job one way or the other. You've
I
got
need
that,
money.
even though you've got that. Yeah. But but that I hope sort of explains the distinction.
Okay. Maybe you can give some clarification here. I've never thought too much about like what makes a desire and what makes an aversion. Do you think it's more of like something that you have to formulate, or do you think that's it's something that you don't? So like maybe a baby could have a desire, you know?
Yeah, I think this is a good question to be asking, and we'd have to ask some real card-carrying desire satisfaction theorists what they think about that, and some philosophers who work on desire. I think that on at least one view of desire, it's going to turn out that creatures like babies have desires. So I'm thinking of Tim Schroeder's account of desire as sort of the reward system in the brain, um, uh, which I am not sufficiently familiar with to explain. It's deeply rooted in the neuroscience, very sophisticated view, and that allows for any creature who has a reward system to have desire. But if we have a more sophisticated view of desire, so say as being a propositional attitude or something like that, um, then it's not. It's sort of less clear who has desires, what kinds of creatures can have desires and what don't. And so you can see how um, this could be a real problem for desire satisfaction theory, because it seems quite um, obvious to say that that infant humans, so baby humans and non-human animals of all kinds have both well-being and ill-being. But if it turns out that what it is to have a desire requires a very sophisticated kind of psychology, and so the ability to have propositional attitudes, or even um, has sort of relies on having brains like ours. So even if we have a view like Tim Schroeder's, then it's less obvious that this will sort of carry over to small humans or to non-human animals.
Yeah. One of the things that I tell my students is that, what one feature of a theory of well-being is if it has explanatory scope, right? If it can give us an explanation for what well-being is for everything that we think that has well-being. Likewise, you can say the same thing about ill-being, right? A feature of the theory of ill-being is that it can give us an explanation for what's bad for all the things that we think can have ill-being. So if it's the case that it just categorically excludes non-human animals, it's like, okay, well, it's just hard for me to accept that. You know, it's obvious to me that babies and non-human animals can experience ill-being. So maybe like a aversion is something simpler than that, than having some sort of like propositional attitude.
That's right. I think that that would be a sort of good path for the desire satisfaction theorist to say, look, whatever it is that we're talking about when we talk about desires or aversion, they are something that these more rudimentary, as sometimes people put it, more rudimentary psychologies can have. Um, that that's kind of tricky. I'm not sure what to think about that kind of move because, of course, we should sort of look at the accounts of what desire and aversion and other psychological states are. We should look at those accounts on their own merits. So, rather than, the job that they do in connection to this theory of well-being. So a theory like desire satisfaction theory that sort of hinges on some other potentially contentious empirical account, it's not a very comfortable resting place. Um, Now, and I certainly agree with you that a sort of important desideratum of a theory of well-being would be that it explains the well-being of all welfare subjects. Now, there is an alternative, however, which is to say that there are in fact different theories of well-being for different kinds of welfare subjects. Or perhaps that there are different theories of well-being that cover different phases of one kind of welfare subject over different phases of their life. Those approaches, those variablist approaches, however, have quite a lot of drawbacks, of course. You might think, well, just right off the bat, it's just sort of less theoretically attractive.
Yeah.
Whenever we can, we want to have one theory that does all of the work rather than lots of little theories. Why should there be such differences?
Yeah.
Especially when it's over the course of one life.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. I'm interested in physics. I can't do the math, but I'm interested in the subject. So I, listen to a lot of these, physicists talk about, quantum mechanics and like, theory of gravity, stuff like that. And they have this same kind of drive, motivation to find the one theory that can unite them all, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
totally.
so I think it's like as a philosopher, like, oh yeah, I feel it too. Like it bothers me if there's like this one theory over here for like the big stuff and one theory over here for the tiny stuff. I don't like that. I just want one theory that like can explain everything.
Yeah,
Or
grand unified theory of well-being, that would be great.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to objective list theory here. So I know that different philosophers will have different items in their list, but as far as I can tell, common items are something like pleasure, and maybe knowledge, achievement, close personal relationships, stuff like that. The pleasure one we already talked about, so let's skip it. Let's think about knowledge. What would the opposite of that be? Is it ignorance or is it just knowing or, like, believing in falsehoods? Like, what is it?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's one of those, was it, uh was it Parmenides who says that, the good is one and the bad are many? This seems to be, it's either Parmenides or Pythagoras, but this knowledge seems to be where things get really interesting. And this was first explored, in this terrific and and very important paper that sort of set the agenda for the discussion of well-being, by Shelley Kagan, called An Introduction to Ill-Being. And he just does this masterful job going through all of the possible opposites of knowledge. So if knowledge is a good, it's just not at all clear what the opposite of knowledge would be. And of those many opposites, which of them are in fact robustly bad for you, or just sort of less good than knowledge. So we might think that having, say, um, a justified true belief that isn't, doesn't have the anti-Gettier condition, like that seems pretty good. That's pretty close to knowledge. But then we might think if your belief isn't justified, that seems sort of less good. But is it in fact bad for you? We might think that maybe it's bad if it's sort of bad because it was like kind of your fault. So so it's like, your cognitive powers were sort of misused by you. So if you're sort of being deceived by an evil demon, maybe then it's not your fault. We might think that's just, it's just bad luck. Doesn't sort of count against you and your well-being. But if it is you and your sort of poor reasoning that's got you into this mess, then that is a bad for you. But then that also seems a bit arbitrary. So why should it only be if it's my fault that it's bad for me? If it were just, it seems like it is also bad to be in an epistemic state where I still, in spite of my best efforts, I'm in a bad. So that we, when we're in the experience machine, we might think one of the things that's not merely a privation of good, but in fact intrinsically bad, is that we're totally deceived in spite of having what appears to us to be all the best evidence for our true beliefs. And so just as you say, so ignorance, that seems, so just sort of a privation of knowledge, that somehow seems to be a robust bad, even though it's a mere privation of a good. So how are we going to account for that? And then, of course, having a sort of I think where Shelley Kagan sort of lands as the worst of all bads would be sort of persisting in having a false belief, in spite of having evidence to the contrary. That sort of seems to be the worst. So not only do you have a false belief, but it's also that you have everything at your disposal that could sort of get you out of this mess, but you still sort of, by misuse of your own cognitive resources, nevertheless end up in this bad epistemic state. But this is so. But what explains the various grades of all of these different bads, I think is sort of underexplored. So we'd have to sort of go in a little deeper and figure out, well, what is it that makes knowledge good in the first place? And then how do those answers allow us to account for the various shades of epistemic bads? So I feel like there's this whole research program to be sorted out right there.
Yeah, it's not obvious to me like what the answer is. So if let's say we think knowledge is justified true belief, the the opposite would be unjustified false belief. Like I feel like an unjustified false belief would be worse for you than an unjustified true belief. I don't know, but yeah, that gets me thinking about like the justification part. Like, why does that matter in terms of something being bad for me? Like it. Part of me thinks, no, if you just have a false belief, it's just bad for you. It doesn't matter if it was justified or unjustified. It doesn't matter if you had the resources there in front of you to correct your belief, but you just didn't use it.
Yeah, well, we might think that both of those are bad and sort of bad for sort of similar yet different reasons. So the sort of like outcome, as it were, of your cognitive efforts, in the best case, that's going to be knowledge, having a justified true belief. But in the bad cases, it's going to be having a false belief. So we might think that there's something um, good, even if lucky, about having a true belief, and something bad, even if lucky, about having a false belief. Like those are just sort of the right output, as it were, and the wrong output of your cognitive capacities. And then we might sort of look at your cognitive capacities and appeal to sort of the same way, that with the same sort of machinery that we might use to explain other goods and bads. So, sort of using your own capacities well or using them badly, those can be those can be sources of both good and bad. So the better you exercise your cognitive capacities, the better you're doing. So that might be, say, evaluating your evidence. So whether your belief is justified is something you have done. So that seems in some way something that's creditable to you and perhaps contributes intrinsically to your well-being. So we might think also then that sort of misusing your cognitive faculties is perhaps a robust bad for you. So if you're failing to reason correctly or something like that, failing to evaluate or appreciate the evidence that you have, we might think that's intrinsically bad for you. Less clear to me how we would think that's how we would sort of get the verdict, as it were, that misusing your capacities, what it means to misuse your capacities, even if you're, sort of, you might be using them less well than you could otherwise. That just strikes me as a sort of privation. Um, uh, and I suppose any of what I'm saying right now could be drawn from by an objective list theorist, but it's perhaps getting a little ahead since I think of this as more naturally a part of a perfectionist theory of well-being.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's talk about achievement. I've seen something like achievement on an objective list before. So what would the opposite of that be? Be failure, maybe?
Yeah, totally. So this is similar, I think, to the knowledge case, and to the kind of puzzles that we see with or that we saw with desire satisfaction theory. Because you might think so. So I think it seems quite natural to say that the opposite of achievement is failure. But if we think about a lot of achievements in our lives, a lot of the time what we achieve may not actually sort of looked at from another angle. It's not clear what the opposite of it would have been in any case. um, so that is to say that it's not clear that sort of how might I put it, failing to achieve is always a failure. If that sounds sort of unclear, but so say for example, look, a lot of people who are sort of recreational runners like to do things like run a 5K, and you might think, well, what's the for most people who do that sort of thing, they might have some goals in mind, like, run in a certain time, maybe better than you did last year or something like that. Um, but by and large, the sort of it's an achievement just to kind of cross the finish line. And most people seem to treat their doing of it in just that way. Um, so even if so really not have that achievement would be to what, simply, give up partway through. But that rarely happens. So it's usually, no matter what you do to get yourself across the finish line, that's an achievement. Um, the not doing of it is just sort of privation of the effort, or of the work you might put into that. Um, so if we're going to explain how some failures can be sort of robustly bad for you, we need to sort of go in and do a little a little careful philosophy about what exactly it is for something to be an achievement, and what it is for something to be a failure, and how they're related. And I have quite a lot of thoughts about that if you wanted
I
to hear
bet.
more.
I
I
bet you
I wrote a
do.
paper on this very
Yeah.
topic.
I think you wrote a book on achievement.
I did. I did,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
and then I wrote a paper about failure. So, yeah, so in the book on achievement, one of the things that I say is that, sort of surprisingly, many apparent failures are in fact achievements, because what they are is they're just sort of, falling short of some goal or other. Um, but nevertheless, getting as far as you did still is itself an achievement, even if it's not the achievement you had in mind. And I say this because, at least on my kind of achievements, I don't think it's essential to have a goal in order to have an achievement. And I have this view because, quite simply, that seems to me true to life. In the race case that I described, it's not at all clear what the goal is. It's often something sort of loosey goosey. I think in doing philosophy, we rarely have, very specific goals, but we certainly have all sorts of achievements all the time. I think in other aspects of life, like being a good friend or being a good parent, it's totally unclear what those goals amount to and whether they are ever achieved. But certainly, as we live our lives in the ways that we do, we nevertheless think of those things in our lives as achievements. Okay, so that's why it's important for me on my account of achievement to not have goals. Um, so that's why, so say if my, goal in running the 5K is to run faster than I did last year, um, and suppose I don't. I, in fact, am 1 minute slower. So I cross the finish line in, 29 minutes instead of 28 minutes or whatever. And so I might think, oh, it's a failure. But hey, wow, I just ran really fast. I just ran 5 kilometers in 29 minutes. You might imagine somebody doing that. Like, whoo, they exerted a lot of effort. Everybody's cheering. It certainly seems like it would be ridiculous to say that that's a failure. So that led me in the book to say, well, actually, as it happens, many failures are valuable for the same reasons as achievements. They are, in fact, little achievements. We're just not always appreciative of what we've done. So then, though, when it comes to failures, we need to, so I think we nevertheless want to be able to explain, if we want to say that failures are a robust bad, we're going to need some more philosophical machinery. Um, so, maybe to use the examples that you proposed at the beginning, so like getting fired or something like that, or not getting the promotion. So both of those we might think are failures in one way. We might also take the race example. So why is it, on the other hand, that sort of not meeting that goal is, it's, even if it is good qua achievement, we might think it's also bad qua failure. So what explains that? Well, one difference between achievement, as I understand it, and failure, as it seems to be, is that failures do require goals. They So in order for something to count as a failure, it has to sort of not match up with the goal that you had in mind. Of course, there might be sort of external standards for things that seem on the outside to count as failures, but I think it matters more what we think are our goals, and so that's what I develop in the account. Um, and so that's one essential part of it. Um, and another feature, though, of the goal is that often it's not just that. So you might think, oh, well, that's always, it's not meeting your goal. That's a failure and that's intrinsically bad. But of course, that's a mere privation. It's just not meeting the goal. So what I propose is how we think about goals is that often when we set goals for ourselves, we don't just have the goal in mind, but we also have a contrastive end in mind. So there's a sort of second part of our goal. And that's what we, in fact, do not want. We're averse to, as it were, the contrast to the goal. So so in the race case, it might be that my goal is to run in 28 minutes rather than 29 minutes, or rather than anything slower. And in the case of promotion, we might think my goal is to get promoted rather than get fired or something like that. So then we can sort of draw from conceptual resources to say that when our goal, that when the positive contrastive end is fulfilled, that counts as a success. That if the negative contrastive end, if that comes to pass, then insofar as that's a sort of the opposite of our willing, it's sort of an attitude akin to being averse to it, then we can start to develop some conceptual resources to say how if the negative contrastive end comes to pass, then that's a robust bad. So that's part of the account of how I explain for the badness of failures. And see, it ends up being quite complicated.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like, the opposite of achievement is not necessarily consisting of the opposite of the components that make an achievement, right? Because I think for
That's
your
right.
conception of achievement, it requires intense effort,
That's right.
right? So that means, but failure is not partly constituted by the opposite of intense effort.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's not like what would that be, like moderate laziness or something? Like
Yeah.
that would be the opposite of intense effort. Yeah. No, I mean, maybe some failures have a moderate laziness or even intense laziness if there is such a thing as a component, but that's certainly not essential to failures. Quite the opposite. I'm sure many failures have a lot of intense effort. But what seems to matter is that the negative contrastive of the end that's been set comes to pass. So then they become even less symmetrical, or even more anti-symmetrical than achievements. It's not essential for achievement to have goals, but it is essential for failures to have goals.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So let's move on to something like close personal relationships or loving relationships. Would the opposite of that be hateful relationships, unhealthy, abusive relationships.
Yeah, this I think is another one of those areas where it's unclear what the opposite would be, and it might again be that the good is one and the bad are many. One puzzling thing is that something that certainly seems to be a robust bad, but is a mere privation, is loneliness. So the privation of relationships, bizarrely, seems to be something that's in fact robustly bad for people to have. Of course, there's also empirical evidence that it's very, at least instrumentally, very bad for you to not have relationships. But I think intuitively, it seems to be intrinsically bad for people to be lonely. So, but just sort of taken as just in that description, it's not clear at all. Pardon me. So the opposite of friendship or good relationships might be loneliness, but that seems to be a mere privation. And certainly having dysfunctional relationships seems to be a robust bad. But again, what explains that would have to be we'd have to sort of take a look at the accounts that one might give about what explains why having friendships or having relationships is an intrinsic good. Um, there's work I think to be done there as well.
Yeah. This is where I often find hedonism appealing because of its simplicity. It's like, well, yeah, because you're pleasurable and, like being alone is only bad if it's painful for you, right? It's
That's
totally
right.
subjective.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that is certainly, I mean, hedonism's main attraction, I think, is its just massive explanatory power, and its simplicity. It's able to explain basically everything, since just about everything that's good for us seems obviously to also feel good or to cause good feelings. And then it's sort of capacious in this way that it can also get the contingencies, since of course, um, being alone can also feel really good. It can seem to be good for some people. Although I suppose, a sort of uh an Aristotelian insight sort of wants to come up here and say something like, look, even if it sort of feels good to be alone, we might sort of be failing to attend to the deep nature of our humanity, which is it's sort of against our nature to be alone all the time. And even if we might sort of prefer to be alone a lot of the time, there's something about being with other people that sort of calls to us as who we are, even if in
Yeah.
in some moments it's unpleasant to do that.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about that nature fulfillment theory, or perfectionism, as it's sometimes referred to. So what's good for you, non-instrumentally good for you, is to kind of develop and exercise your characteristic human capacities, and that's generally how we understand it to be. So then the opposite of that is a privation, is not developing your characteristic human capacities, or is it developing, I don't know, some other species characteristic capacities?
Yeah, this is a great question. So so I'll probably refer to it as perfectionism, and how, and indeed, the sort of like standard out of the box perfectionist theories, um, even on paper, have sort of admitted that there's no place to go below zero, for perfectionism. You exercise your core capacities. You can sort of do it better or worse, but even when you're doing it not very well, you're still kind of doing it. And the worst you can do is just sort of do nothing with your core capacities. So sort of so initial versions of perfectionism don't give us accounts of robust bads or intrinsic bads. Um, so we have to sort of develop some conceptual resources. I quite like your thought that it might be that there's something intrinsically bad about developing the wrong capacities, although it's hard to say what that would look like, because do we have different I mean, we only have the capacities that we have as human beings. But I sort of I sort of be curious to see what that would amount to.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
this is some random thought that I had, but there was this video that I watched and that I show my students of this kid who became blind. And he taught himself to use echolocation,
Oh, I love that.
And it's just like,
Wow.
well, you're not a bat.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's what bats do. But
Yeah,
I it's
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's fascinating. And I think then I'm almost inclined to say that, if we had thought that it's intrinsically bad for you to develop, extra human capacities that aren't typically human, I think that would be a counterexample because it certainly doesn't seem bad for that person to develop the capacity to echolocate. Quite the contrary, it seems at the very least instrumentally good, if not also intrinsically good. It's very impressive as well. So that's pretty neat. I think some perfectionists have said things like, when we look at other species, there's sort of no temptation to think that it would be good for like a bird to develop theoretical reason. Um, I don't know. I myself have sort of no intuitions about that. I don't know how to. It doesn't seem to me at all obvious that it wouldn't also be good for birds to have those capacities. Um, so I'm not sure how much we should attach to sort of these divisions of species, um, rather than think, if you have these kinds of capacities uh, that seem to be good sources of flourishing, regardless of whether or not they are something that are sort of distinctive to your species or not, uh, they might be good to develop nonetheless. Although that kind of puts some pressure on what it is that we're talking about when we talk about human nature or perfectionism as a theory. But that's, of course, a story for another day.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, again, it's not obvious to me what the opposite of what the theory of ill-being would be if we're talking about something like nature fulfillment theory. And I wonder, is that would that be, like, a negative of nature fulfillment theory? That there's no corresponding ill-being theory?
Yes, I think so. And but there's sort of different things you could do with that. So one option is to be talk about going in the opposite direction of the grand unified theory. You can be a pluralist about well-being, even within, even, not shifting from one, say, kind of welfare subject to another, but it might just be that perfectionist goods are one of the things that's good for us, and then also pleasure and pain are bad for or pleasure is good for us and pain is bad for us. So, in other words, we're basically just going to have an objective list theory. It's just one of the, many of the things on the objective list are explained by what perfectionism says. So I should mention also, it's a huge problem for perfectionism to explain the positive value of pleasure and the negative value of pain. So, in fact, some perfectionist views sort of early on just sort of merely say that those things are instrumentally good and instrumentally bad. I think that's a huge price to pay. And so in some recent work by me and then a couple of other papers, one by Antti Kauppinen, and great criticism from Guy Fletcher. So there's been some sort of like attempts to kind of answer some of these questions. And to sort of give perfectionism both the resources to explain the positive value of pleasure, negative value of pain, and more generally, how anything is bad for you. Um, so, so I could say a little bit about that if you, I don't know, I don't know how
Yeah.
much time there is, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
we can go into that.
yeah, okay. So just briefly, so what I propose, and and it's sort of and I'll also mention, so anti-Calpinen has a somewhat similar view, but the view that I propose is to have a sort of teleological view in which we identify not only the capacities that are central to our well-being, but looking carefully at capacities, they're not just sort of capacities to engage in activities, but they're capacities that are sort of set toward specific ends. And those ends are specific insofar as they're the sort of proper outcome or the proper output of those capacities. And that means that there's also a sort of wrong output. So when I was describing knowledge, that's the value of knowledge and the disvalue of things like false beliefs. That was drawing from these perfectionist resources. So the thought is that um, knowledge is the proper output of our capacity for theoretical rationality. So, of course, it's good for us in perfectionist terms to exercise our theoretical rationality. And on top of that, it's good for us to attain the proper output to our exercise of our rational capacities, and that's knowledge. So since we have this sort of third category of the capacity, its exercise and its output, and we have this notion that the output has a proper output and then a sort of opposite output. In this case, it would be a false belief or something like that. Um, then we sort of now have value theoretic resources. We have an opposite. We can say that attaining the opposite, there's a sort of mismatch between the exercise of capacity and its output. That we can say is an intrinsic bad, as opposed to merely a privation, which would be no output at all. So if you exercise your theoretical rationality and you don't come to any conclusion, that's an intrinsic neutral, we might say. We don't have the good of knowledge, but we also don't have the bad of a false belief. But if we exercise our theoretical rationality and we get a false belief, that's the opposite of the very thing that this capacity is for, as it were, and so that's an intrinsic bad. So that's the account that I give for how to explain intrinsic goods and bads on, more specifically bads, according to perfectionism. You can do the same thing to explain failure, and in a more complicated and roundabout way, you can do something similar to explain the badness of pain. If we have as a goal to have states that are pleasant and avoid states that are painful, then when we have the opposite of our goal, the negative contrastive, we're in pain. And so in a way, we can use our practical rationality, the failure of practical rationality, to explain the badness of pain. So that's one approach that a perfectionist.
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
but then you're saying practical rationality is that capacity?
Yes. So it's practical rationality. So if our practical rationality that's one of our sort of traditional core human capacities. And we might say that sort of proper output of practical rationality is to achieve our ends. And if we draw from the account of failure that I gave a moment ago, where often our ends are contrastive, so the proper output of practical rationality is to achieve the positive contrastive of the end. The opposite, or the malfillment, as I put it, of the capacity is when we end up with the negative contrastive, the thing that we're aiming against. So that constitutes the robust bout of failure. And as it happens, just given the way pleasure and pain feel, we typically have as a goal to feel pleasure rather than pain. So when we feel pain, this constitutes the negative contrastive, the attainment of the negative contrastive of that end. And so it's a failure of practical rationality.
Interesting. Okay. I don't think I ever thought of it in terms of practical rationality. And I guess this raises the deeper question for me, which is what is the corresponding capacity? Like, I thought it was, I don't know, like just the capacity to feel sensations or something. Like that's the characteristic capacity, you know? So
Yeah,
there's not
totally.
necessarily a telos there.
No, I know, but the thing with that though is that the capacity to feel sensations is being fulfilled even when you feel bad things. So we'd have to say that it's good for you and it's like, yay, pain, like you're feeling things, and that doesn't seem right at all. Um, so that can't quite be right. Now there is another sort of move that one can make, and so Antti Kauppanen in a recent paper suggests this as an alternative for the perfectionist, and um, that's that pain, along with pleasure, can be analyzed as a representational state that has a telos built into it. So the very feeling of pain, the phenomenology of pain, comes with an inbuilt telos, and that telos is to be got rid of. So when you feel pain, what the pain presents to you is get rid of this, less of this. And so that's how we might explain the bad feel of pain as being bad for us. So pain is the telos of pain is attained when it's got rid of. So when we have pain, that's a bad thing. So he that's the move he makes. I love that. I think it's such a good response. Better maybe than the one that I give in my paper. So,
But how
so
does
so
that,
that's another, yeah.
yeah, how does that fit within a nature fulfillment account though?
Yeah, it's not, maybe nature isn't the way to think of it, but if we think of sort of like states as having teleology. So that's where we're sort of drawing from that. So it's the pain, the state of being in pain has a little goal, and that little goal is to be got rid of. So if we think less about nature and more about goal-oriented features of ourselves as constituting our good, when we achieve those various teloi, so achieving the teloi of pain is to get rid of the pain. So when we have the pain state, then it's a bad thing because we haven't reached the goal of pain, which is to get rid of it. Does that make
Interesting.
sense?
Okay.
Yeah, it's
I
quite a
kind of.
complex and appealing and exciting view. I mean, I think there's still problems with it, but it's perfectionism is in a real sort of pickle when it comes to explaining the badness of pain.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't really discovered an argument that I find fully addresses my concerns when it comes to, the disvalue of pain. If you want to say that, pain is bad because there's this built-in telos of just like getting rid of it, does that mean, I mean, does that only apply to pain? Or does it apply to other things that we find intrinsically bad? There's just this built-in telos there that we want to get rid of it. Like according to him.
Oh, well, I don't know what Auntie would say about that. You'll have to ask him, I guess. But yeah, because you might say, look, it's just you sort of get for free of everything that's intrinsically bad that it ought to be got rid of. In fact, some people even say that it's sort of analytic on the bad that it gives a reason to get rid of. So it's not in a sense that we're not sort of uh, we don't really add to the discussion by pointing out that pain has this feature, because of course it does, but it has that feature because it is bad. We can't use that feature to explain its badness. That is its badness. So that I think would be a really good objection against against the view that's being proposed.
Okay. Yeah, no, those a lot of stuff there. I'm gonna have to think about this for for a
Yeah, me
long
too.
time.
Yeah, it ends up being a real puzzle. I mean, I think for me, even though I've written on perfectionism, I find that its explanation for pain and its badness is not satisfying. I think that it just doesn't do well there. One of the things that we were talking about before and having a grand unified theory of well-being, I think perfectionism really falters since it's totally unobvious that this highly convoluted view of appealing to practical rationality, like surely infants, like, well, I mean, when does that even come online? Like what, like, well, I don't know, like age 8 maybe. So we don't want to say like human beings below age 8, pain isn't bad for them. Surely it is. So then we sort of have to commit ourselves to either pluralism about well-being or some kind of variablist approach where there's simply a different view of well-being. Um, and neither of those are all of that theoretically satisfying if we want to have one single unified theory of well-being.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much. I feel like there are so many things we didn't even get to cover. So more than happy to talk about this. It was great.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.